Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's award plenary session, where we'll be hearing presentations from two of our award winners. Our first presentation is from the recipient of the 2017 RAMÓN Margalef Award for Excellence in Education, Dr. Carolyn Solomon, who is professor in the Department of Biology at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. This award recognizes excellence in teaching and mentoring in the fields of limnology and oceanography. And Carolyn is receiving the Margalef Award for her extraordinary accomplishments in bringing the deaf and hearing worlds in science together, coupled with her exceptional skill as a mentor, educator, and leader to inspire us all. And this year's award is not only about excellence in teaching, but also about being a role model for young people, specifically those who have a barrier to overcome that most of us can't even comprehend, being deaf or hard of hearing. And as a deaf person herself, Carolyn's mission is to train the next generation of biologists who happen to be deaf or hard of hearing, and to show them by example that they can succeed by focusing on what they are capable of and not on limitations. Carolyn became deaf after contracting spinal meningitis at 15 months old. Her interest in pursuing a career in environmental science began when, as a teenager, she lived next to a creek that was so polluted you couldn't swim in it. And as an avid swimmer, that made a lasting impression on her. She earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard and a master's and PhD degrees in biological oceanography from the University of Washington and the University of Maryland. And during her time in graduate school, she realized that in addition to garnering a career in environmental science, she also wanted to influence other deaf and hard of hearing students. She's done an exemplary job by providing her students with resources, opportunities, and a platform to succeed in their pursuits of the aquatic sciences. She's hosted numerous students in her lab for internships, and she connects her students with the Research Experience for Undergraduates program in partnership with Maryland Sea Grant College. In collaboration with colleagues at the University of Washington, she's developed an online database of technical signs for American Sign Language in science, technology, engineering, and math, which is critical for breaking down communication barriers. Carolyn's efforts have contributed to a fourfold increase in undergraduate matriculation from her university into STEM graduate and professional schools. She's received department and university teaching awards and has been spotlighted in the national media, including being featured on National Public Radio for its 50 Great Teachers series, which I urge you to look up and listen to. It's a great story. So please join me in congratulating Dr. Carolyn Solomon for receiving this year's Margalef Award.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm even more humbled to be receiving an award named after RAMÓN Margalef, who was a dynamic teacher who loved sharing his ideas with his students. Now, you might be wondering why I use the word hidden in my topic, and you think I'm pretty visible because I've got my entourage with me throughout the whole conference, but the word hidden I chose meant we're hidden in numbers. And I want to talk about being hidden in the underrepresented group of limnology and oceanography, and we are the deaf and hard of hearing scientists. So the harsh reality is that, and what is very interesting, is that deaf and hard of hearing students, they declare a STEM undergraduate major as the same proportion as hearing students do at 17%. But by the time they get to the PhD, it's less than 1%. So there's a huge, huge leak somewhere between the graduate level and PhD, and that's a huge concern. And at that realization, it led to a workshop that was hosted at Gallaudet in 2012. We brought in deaf scientists who work in academia, in institutions, graduate students, undergraduates, and some high school students. So we had an open discussion about what we were doing because we knew what our perspective on science was essential. We had ideas and contributions, and there were a time that there were many deaf scientists who have made great contributions to science. The father of internet, Vincent Cerf, is deaf, and he created the internet. And so the result of this workshop was a white paper that for the very first time was able to look at deaf scientists. We talked about the students' experience, our experiences as professionals. How do we incorporate deaf and hard of hearing students in REUs, and interpreting resources. But before I go into all of that, I want to talk about my students. The first picture on the upper left was my very first student that worked with me when I was a PhD student. At that time, I was involved with the NSF Biocomplexity Project, and so I needed to bring a student with me now, even though I was still a PhD student, and that student is actually from Hawaii. He grew up on Maui. And then a few years later, I started to do my own research lab, and I started to invite other students who were not Gallaudet students, but coming in from other colleges and universities to come to Gallaudet. So one of my first students, who's from the University of Southern Florida, is the one on the right, and she worked in my lab with microcystis, and she came to ASLO through the ASLO's multicultural program. And then the bottom photo were my two students that were working on the Anacostia River, which is in Washington, D.C. And they, too, also came to ASLO that was held here in Hawaii 3 years ago. And again, they were also sponsored through the multicultural program. Ving, in yellow, is working as a scientist. Cody is in graduate school, and Anna is now a lab technician with plans to go to graduate school. And here are other students who are coming from other universities. We have Arizona State University represented, University of Western Illinois, and with Gallaudet students, and this was at the end of a summer research symposium, and they were talking about their research. So you see how excited and engaged they are. One of my students just last summer was very fortunate to be on the very first STEM Sea expedition, going from San Diego, California, here to Hawaii. And she joined Mark Leckie and the student Raquel from UMass. And that's her on the right, and she's a senior at Gallaudet this year, or pardon me, junior. And when she applied for the program, she was really apprehensive about whether to request for an interpreter or not. She was afraid that if she requested for an interpreter, she may not be selected. So she had to make the really tough decision on what to do, and she decided not to bring an interpreter with her. But that cruise offered many classes, which she missed out a little bit on, but I think overall it was a wonderful experience for her. So talking about the growing network of deaf and hard of hearing scientists, I have to tell you that it's a very slow process because there's only 3 of us in the field, and that's been for the last 10 years. And you may wonder, are there any coming through the pipeline? At the very top is Dr. Linda Campbell. She's a limnologist in St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And then there's myself. And then we've got Richard Fulford, who is a fishery scientist at the University of Southern Mississippi. Now, are there any other deaf and hard of hearing coming? There's 2. We've got Barbara Spiegler, who is now a doctoral student at Oregon State University, and our advisor is Bruce Meunier. And then we have another woman, Jennifer Riley, who just finished her master's at SUNY Stony Brook. But if you think about it, that makes 5 of us. And there are thousands and thousands of members in ASLO. Now, allies are very, very important. we would never be where we are today without our allies. I want to mention, now mind you, I'm talking about my allies. Linda and Richard and Barbara may have different allies than myself. First ally for me was ASLO. From the time I was a student until now, ASLO has always provided me access without question. Also, ASLO's multicultural program, led by Ben Cooker, was very welcoming to my students, and Ben, in fact, was the first recipient of this same award. And also the Maryland Sea Grant with Frederica Moser and Mike Allen. They have been so welcoming with my students in their RU program, and I never had to explain what to do, they just knew. Lastly, the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, with so many faculty and students who made me feel welcome and provided access to me, and they were great allies for me throughout the years. But how can we encourage more deaf and hard of hearing students to pursue an interest in limnology and oceanography? We already know that when we apply for NSF grants, we have two criteria we have to meet. One, intellectual merit, and then broad participation. I went to a workshop by Bob Chen this past Sunday morning, and it was awesome. It was a fantastic workshop on how to have broad participation, and if he offers it again, I recommend you attend. One thing that wasn't mentioned was how to broaden participation for people with disabilities. I think one thing when it comes to the desire to broaden your participation, the invitation has to be meaningful. And there was a great blog by Catherine Scott, who was a professor at HCBU, who her message was on point, because oftentimes I get a lot of people sending me flyers, invitations to RUs and graduate programs, but I don't know if they're actively looking for my students. Oftentimes what I do, and I'm gonna tell you my secret, what I do is I give them a copy of my white paper, and then I wanna see if they actually read it. If you read it, you're going to realize that you must accept at least 2 deaf students because they can support each other in the program and whatnot, and also to be sure that you are able to provide access to those students, and then it makes everybody involved to have a wonderful experience. It'll be the students, the people who are hosting the students, so they can gain knowledge from each other. So they have to be really, really careful before I send my students out to any of these programs. I want to mention 4 things, and in talking about how to increase awareness about the conversation, and I intentionally use the word conversation rather than the word communication. And the reason why I chose conversation is that it's a 2-way back and forth street. The interpreters are there for you as well as for me. And I actually gave a talk about this specific subject 10 years ago, over 10 years in Victoria, British Columbia at an ASLO event. And it's also very important to increase the number of sign language interpreters and cued speech interpreters who are comfortable and who are able to interpret in STEM. I'm sure many of you as teachers, you teach people who are not in science major and they say, oh, science is just not my thing. Well, interpreters say the same thing. So I have interpreters come to say and say, oh, science is not my thing, but I'll just try my best, you know, and I'm like, okay, great. So it's just really important to increase the number of interpreters who are comfortable in the field and interpreting science. And to look into different pedagogies for deaf and hard of hearing students, and more specifically for anybody who is a visual learner. Doesn't matter whether they're deaf or hearing, some people just learn visually. And then lastly, I want to talk about the effective way to mentor deaf and hard of hearing students. So in conversations with deaf and hard of hearing scientists, one thing that I've tried to do was I tried to have a session about limnology and oceanography with disabilities, and there were no submissions. The only submission was mine, and that's the only talk, that's it. And it's been over 10 years, and I really would like us to visit this as an idea and have more scientists who have disabilities. And in my talk, I went through with Linda Campbell and about breaking down the communication barriers within limnology and oceanography. And our talk really focused about being flexible and adaptable in communication, and once you do that, anything is possible. For several years, I've been working on a project that's been sponsored by NSF, and those are with colleagues from the University of Washington and the Rochester Institute of Technology. The idea behind the ASL STEM Forum is to build a science, sign language forum where there are many deaf people all over the country that are being very creative in making up signs that we use in science. Some of them are great, some are horrible. But it's important to have a central location for people to submit these signs, and then we have a rating system as to whether or not we feel that certain signs are usable. And it's been about 5 or 6 years, and the number of signs have increased. We've got terminology and so forth. And it did get a lot of recognition from the press. We had NPR, their takeaway with John Hockenberry, and the New York Times. And then one thing about interpreters now, in the workshop back in 2012, it was a really fascinating discussion on how research about people who persist in science. So one of the research that was done, that initiated at that workshop, was looking at interpreting within the STEM field. So there's been a lot of research in the legal field of interpreting, medical side, but nothing in science. So this research study asked a survey of what do deaf scientists want from their interpreters? What kind of competencies do they want in their interpreters? And we asked many, many questions in that study, but I'm just going to mention 2. How knowledgeable do you prefer your interpreters to be in your discipline? Well, 93% said, well, yes, they do. And we polled 97 deaf and hard of hearing scientists for this. And then also, how important is it that the interpreters have training, whether it's a workshop, a seminar, classes for interpreting within your discipline? And about 85% said yes. However, the very interesting part, in addition, is that the interpreter, if they have training in computer science, a biologist is okay with that, just as long as they have training in a STEM field. And in the classroom, we looked into the pedagogy, and a hearing person can look at a slide and listen to what's being said, but a person who is a visual learner has to look at the teacher, the slide, the interpreter, the captioner, and sometimes whatever experiment is happening there. And so they're searching around the room all at the same time. So Kush Logner did an experiment wearing glasses to test eye gaze, and they set up 4 different classrooms to see what percentage of time the students spent looking at a slide, the interpreter, the captions, or the teacher. And then also using that eye gaze study, you can see on the left, you have a hearing person, and you can see in pink where their eyes are, and that the hearing person can follow along on the slide precisely where the speaker is addressing their issues. But then the person who is deaf, as showcased on the right, they're all over the slide because the deaf person is looking at the interpreter, then back to the slide and trying to find where we are on the slide. So as a teacher, please keep in mind that allow for a little bit of lag time. And if you think about it, if you're just waiting a few seconds, it will benefit the whole room. And then also with the teaching study with the Social Environment Synthesis Center, We're very interested in increasing competencies within synthesis between natural sciences and social sciences, and using a concept map as our goal, and that's a wonderful visual aid, and it's perfect for deaf and hard of hearing students. So we will soon be publishing a module in Thai about this. And you can see, I have a photo of my students, and this is a great activity to see how engaged they are, and they're looking at the different components within the system, and so this is a great teaching tool. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the mentoring for deaf and hard of hearing students. And traditionally, mentoring studies will look at, does the mentee increase the knowledge of content? Are they able to network and so forth? But there hasn't been any real look at the social and cultural aspect of mentoring. So here's a model that really shows that you have the aspirational capital, you have familial capital, you have social capital, navigational, resistance, and linguistic capital, and then finally the community and cultural wealth. But we've added another component to the model, cultural capital, which we can merge as deaf capital. In the first mentoring study that was done by Jason Littman, it was interesting in the results because they found the psychology of deaf space to be crucial. It's very essential to have access to academia, the culture, and discourse. And the lab design was essential for visual ability, and this is what my lab looks like. You know, most labs, they've got shelving that runs from wall to wall, end to end, right? We took them all down. We don't even have them anymore, so that the lab is wide open. Students can see across the room, and they can see each other. Also, in between lab benches, we have that also open so that we can see each other, so there's no shelving and no wall there, so that we're able to communicate with each other. And the interesting thing is that there are psychological effects to the students. They're a lot more excited about science. They're looking and seeing what's happening with their fellow classmates. And finally, with the mentoring, my colleagues at Gallaudet just published this month their research about mentoring deaf and hard of hearing students. They found that gender has no bearing. And what was more important was that the hard of hearing and deaf community would have the understanding and being able to ask for accommodations to provide communication access for their students. And another thing that was important to know is that the hearing status of the mentor makes no difference. What was more important was that the person understood the cultural awareness and that we had our communication barriers. Also, and to let the deaf people have the connection with their own deaf community. Now, I have to talk about my PhD advisor, Pat Gleibert, and I will tell you, I will never forget, in my very first PhD committee meeting, all the members drove in for the meeting, and there was no interpreter to show up. So what Pat did, she says, okay, well, I'm going to write it down for you. And I had access to the meeting because she wrote everything down. And so from every meeting I had from there on as my PhD studies, she wrote everything down to make sure that I got it all. So when I finished, I had a beautiful stack of notes for the last 5 years in my PhD studies. And I still have them, by the way. So where do we go from here? But I am running out of time. I want to just hit the last point, is that deaf and hard of hearing people have been talking about developing a database of the professional societies and organizations who have had experience with deaf and hard of hearing people. This is where ASLO is the top of the field. I want to talk to you here to talk to other professional societies, and that's your role that I'm asking you to take. And it's really important to inspire young children to be interested in the limnology and oceanography. This is my son, who is hard of hearing. He loves going out boating with mom, and he gets very excited about doing science with me. And I want to emphasize it's so very important to include deaf and hard of hearing people in every aspect of doing science. For example, tonight I invited students from the Hawaii School for the Deaf and Blind so they can see what scientists do. We stand here in front of other people and other scientists, so I want to thank them for coming. And I want to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you for the award. I have not even thought of that. I think we as different individuals with the American Chemical Society, they're another excellent society, and they actually have a section called Scientists with Disabilities, but so many others. For a deaf person, it's so very frustrating asking for access. So I think you're right, though. That's a great umbrella to try to reach out to other societies, and ASLO could be a great example.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. So I have an idea I want to put out. So in the community that works on diversity issues, we emphasize what diverse people bring to the table. It's not that we're just doing favors for folks. It's we're learning, we're growing through, we're being enriched, right? So I don't know how much folks have thought about how the deaf community, the hard of hearing community, what they can bring, acuteness in visual aspects, tactile aspects. Has there been some discussion about this, that it's not only breaking down barriers, but bringing in new perspectives?
Yes, and actually right now I'm writing a manuscript about how we can bring a lot to science. And also, it would be some outstanding work with Gala to figure out how the brain works. So the brain and language, that could really contribute to the society. Like, for example, we had 2 deaf women back in the early 1900s who were working at Harvard in the observatory, and they counted over 1,000 different stars. And so they have made huge contributions to science, and we want to see that continue.
Thank you.
Okay, one more.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. That was very inspiring. I relate to this issue a lot because my sister happens to be deaf as well. I come from Spain originally, so but right now I live here, I work here. So one technical question for you. If I was to take on a deaf student, who is paying for the interpreter? So how do I get the interpreter? And number 2, who is paying for that service?
Well, I don't know much about Europe. I do know about the American system. If it's a university generally will pay. But when it comes to an REU, that could be a little bit complicated. Oftentimes, the programs are grant programs, but in my white paper, we do have recommendations on how to resolve that and different ideas on how to resolve that. Thank you.
Thank Carolyn again, and congratulate her on the award.